Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I just wanted to do a short video with another big what if in the history of comics. And today I want to talk about what if Marvel had licensed all the DC characters. Now, it sounds crazy. We have seen a few times in the past where companies have licensed out their stable of characters. In particular, of course, the most famous is when Marvel was in bankruptcy in 1996. They farmed out their big superheroes like the Avengers and the Fantastic Four to the people at Image for 1 year. Uh, my understanding is that financially that was successful. Creatively, it was a complete disaster. But part of the good thing from Marvel was that it showed all the fans how much sort of better the traditional versions were of the characters. So when they returned to Marvel, they were able to have these big hyped relaunches where they had these back to basic approaches with back to basics sort of classic writers like Kurt Busiek doing Avengers and Mark Waid on Fantastic Four. So it turned out okay, but I want to talk about a much bigger what if, and that's the idea of Marvel doing the DC superheroes. Marvel and DC have been rivals since the early 60s, and just recently there's been some discussion of this possibility after DC had their most recent implosion just a couple weeks ago, where they canceled like a whole ton of their books and they fired like all their top brass and a whole bunch of their staff. And combined with the fact that they've ditched Diamond, there's a lot of people speculating that Warner, who owns DC, is no longer really committed to putting out the comics because the comics are a loss leader, and Warner really gets their money from the movies and from the licensing with the characters, and so it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to be doing the comics anymore. So maybe this is a first step towards DC eventually licensing out to another comic book company. Now, if they were to do that today, it's very unlikely to me that it would be Marvel, aka Disney, that would take over the publication of that. I think, particularly with the competition on the movie side of things between Disney and Warner Brothers, I don't see the companies playing ball like that. I think it's much more likely if DC ever did this that it would be a third party that would be taking it over, something like Boom or IDW or Dark Horse, that where they do a lot of licensed comics. But the possibility has been talked about. But here's something that I think a lot of fans maybe don't know, is that this actually almost happened for real in 1984. So according to Jim Shooter, if you think back to DC in 1984, they were actually in almost the same situation then as they are now. The comics were failing across the board. This was before Crisis. It was before their big creative renaissance in the mid 80s, where they had things like Watchmen and The Dark Knight and Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they revamped everything. Before that, a few years before that, at the beginning of 1984, DC was losing money for Warner Brothers, and Warner, they wanted the properties, of course, because they were getting all the merchandise deals from the TV shows like Wonder Woman, the movies like Superman, and all the toys and the T-shirts and stuff like that. But the comics were just failing. Marvel had a huge lion's share of the market at that point. DC was relatively small, at about its smallest in terms of market share, and so they were just losing money hand over fist. So according to Jim Shooter, at the beginning of 1984, the head honcho at Warner Publishing, the people that were actually, DC was just one of their many divisions. So the big boss over there called Jim Shooter directly and said, we are losing money. We don't want to publish the comics anymore. Would Marvel be interested in licensing the DC characters and taking over the publishing of the DC characters? Of course, Jim Shooter was like gobsmacked, but as someone who was a DC fan and started at DC, the creative possibilities and the possibilities for making a ton of money, he thought were amazing. He thought that they could sell the books much better than DC was doing. So they got a deal worked out, and they were ready to go. And I've got the thing here. What they were going to do is that they were going to launch 7 original titles in Marvel's line of DC books, and the titles were Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Teen Titans, Justice League, and the Legion of Superheroes. And those are going to be their 7. So all the other DC books were going to go away. And it was just going to be those 7. And then once those started selling and they knew exactly what they had in terms of the market, then they would start expanding their DC line of books. Now, Shooter doesn't talk about anything in terms of whether they would, what they're going to do with continuity or the stories or whatever, but he does say that the word leaked out to some of the people, and he had John Byrne. Now, of course, in 1987, John Byrne went to DC and took over the relaunch of Superman. But in 1984, he came to Jim Shooter and he had a fully penciled and inked cover for Marvel's Superman #1, because he just desperately wanted to do the title. And the people there were all angling for the books that they wanted. And once they got things worked out, they figured out, the financial parts of the deal, and they were ready to go. And then they hit a snag that actually had nothing to do with DC at all. According to Jim Shooter, at that time, First Comics filed a lawsuit against Marvel alleging that they had a monopoly and they were using their business practices to tamp down the direct market and sort of freeze out the other publishers. And according to Shooter, this was without merit, but because Marvel already had such a huge market share, the lawyers became worried that if they bought DC and then they suddenly had like a 90% market share, that when this lawsuit came up, Marvel would be looked at as having a monopoly on the comic book market, and they would face severe legal ramifications, which could have even resulted in the company being broken up. Now, this had just happened in the early 80s. For our younger people that don't remember, AT&T was actually broken up by the government because it had too big of a monopoly on the telephone market. So that, I'm sure, was fresh in his mind. So the lawyers basically said, because of this lawsuit from First Comics, it's too dangerous to buy DC. And as a result, that killed the deal. Otherwise, in 1984, Marvel was all set to actually take over the publication of DC Comics. Everything that's happened since then would not have happened, for better or worse. I think we wouldn't have gotten any of those groundbreaking 80s things and the Vertigo, all that. None of that stuff ever would have happened. But on the other hand, we would have had Marvel doing their own version of the DC universe with the DC characters. We would have seen, at that point, DC had been trying for 15 years to copy Marvel's style and to do Marvel style stories in the DC universe. Well, now we would have actually seen what would happen when actual Marvel had control of those characters. I would have been fascinated in particular to see their version of Wonder Woman. And just the idea that with DC and Marvel characters being published at the same company, that they might have done some sort of, Earth 1, Earth 2 sort of crossover, or even an amalgam universe where they bring them all into the same universe. It's amazing to think of the possibilities, and it's just crazy to think that DC Comics basically wouldn't have existed for the last 35 years, and they would have just been a subsidiary of Marvel. It's, to me, one of the really huge what ifs in comics history. What if Marvel had gone through with that deal and signed the licensing agreement to take over Superman and Batman? Can you imagine? We might not have. It's hard to say. The Batman movie in 1989. Now, Michael Uslan already had the rights for the movie rights, but who knows how that might have gotten complicated, and it would have been really strange. So really interesting to think about. Again, it's a thing that I think a lot of fans are not aware that like literally almost happened. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that today in light of all the discussion the last couple of weeks or month or so about the possibility of DC licensing out their characters now or next year. It sounds insane, but it actually is a very real possibility because it almost happened. So thanks very much for watching. I'll have the next origin stories will be posted on Monday. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with everybody. And if anyone has any ideas for videos, I'm always looking for things to talk about here. Let me know if you want to hear more what ifs like this. And of course, I have a bunch more hauls coming in with more back issues that I'm going to be discussing and various things. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.